I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm, a think tank on community sovereignty and socio-spirituality. Today, I'm talking again about Ukraine, and things are moving very fast. So I'm only going to be telling you what it is that I've learned that's new. So this will be on top of the other 4 videos that I put out on Ukraine, and I'm assuming that I'm talking to a sophisticated audience that's already up on a lot of the details. I'm going to start with an article by Aaron Mate on Substack called Urging Regime Change in Russia, Biden Exposes the Aims of the U.S. And then I'm going to look at an organization called the U.S. Peace Council. And Wikipedia says that they are part of what was a puppet organization of the old Soviet Union, which does reveal I used to be so fooled by Wikipedia, I even donated to them. Little did I know that Jimmy Wales was a part of the whole World Economic Forum and that he was just using all of us to get all of that data, make it something we all went to so that then it could become another arm of propaganda. So disappointing. But anyway, I'll be looking at their data and their analysis for whether Putin has actually exhausted all diplomatic means before he invaded Ukraine. And then I'm going to go to Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter is someone who I was following closely soon after 9/11, and I've lost track of since. He was a chief UN weapons inspector and also came from the Marine Corps as an intelligence officer and has a really interesting analysis. And then I'll end with, again, Michael Hudson and follow up on what's happening with the petrodollar in all this. So I'm looking at this as Putin's peace plan and the end of the petrodollar party. Let's look. What Aaron Mate told me that I didn't already know was that Obama had been the one to negotiate the Minsk II agreements. He was the one who said that Ukraine will always be more important to Russia than it is to the U.S. And so against all the war hawks who were in his cabinet, he said we need to negotiate a peace agreement. So the Minsk II gave Donbass limited autonomy in return for Russia agreeing to demilitarize and to pull back all of their support for that region. That was met with violent protest in Kiev, where there was the entire group that had done the Maidan uprising. So they didn't want any kind of peace with Russia, and they didn't want to accommodate the Russian-speaking Donbass area. So the next administration completely undermined that. As soon as Obama was out of office, Lindsey Graham and John McCain went to Ukraine and said, "Your fight is our fight. We will go back to Washington and we will make sure that they know that we're going to back you and we're going to send you weapons and we're going to support your entrance into NATO." Aaron includes a chart from the RAND Corporation in which they look at different military moves like arming Syrian rebels and what is going to unbalance Russia. And Ukraine and giving them lethal aid is the one with a moderate chance of success. And even though it's high cost and high risk, it has the biggest possible benefit. It is so cold-blooded to look at these as just strategies, as if they're just pieces on a chessboard. In 2021, because Ukraine is Joe Biden's pet project, there are 2 different agreements that the U.S. entered into with Ukraine in order to support them for NATO membership and to agree to supply them with arms, to supply them with training, to make sure that there are NATO-ready troops that are already there and that there is an enhanced integration. And so they became an enhanced opportunity partner so that they would have these special considerations. Now, what about Zelensky? Zelensky, as a gift to Biden to welcome him, he did additional violence against Donbass. He shut down 3 Russian, pro-Russian TV stations, and he closed down 10 opposition parties. Zelensky was elected on a platform to implement a peace process with the Donbas region. But what he says now is that he had U.S. pressure to make sure to sabotage those negotiations. And so even up to 2 weeks before the invasion, he refused to negotiate. Now, Zelensky, in a recent interview, has said that he asked NATO, just tell me, will we become a member in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, or if not, just tell me no. And what he was told is, you will never be a member of NATO, but publicly we will keep the door open. So he knew that. He knew that all along and has been going along with this idea of just being bait. I think that is morally reprehensible. In the midst of what's been called the largest and fastest arms transfer in history, Biden has gone to Poland and told Polish soldiers that they would soon be seeing action in Ukraine. Now, that would be a major declaration of war, and we have to hope that Putin understands that our president doesn't know what he's saying. So Aaron ended his article by saying that by not exhausting all diplomatic options before invading, that Russia is responsible for the carnage that it's caused. A commenter named Doc Hollywood has posted saying, here are all the things that Russia tried in terms of diplomatic options. What else was there that was on the table? To address that question of whether Russia has used all diplomatic means, I'd like to go to the U.S. Peace Council. What they've done is an analysis that goes through the UN charters and looks at what was available to Russia. And then they look at some of the arguments that are used, like looking at the equivalency of both sides. But what they say is you have to look at who's the aggressor and who's the victim. And in this case, the U.S. has provoked this war without using U.S. soldiers. But that doesn't mean that it isn't still caused by U.S. imperialism and this drive for U.S. hegemony. Next, I'd like to go to Scott Ritter's analysis. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I will have links to these in the description, but you can also go to Substack, and that will include text on a lot of the things I'm talking about. So Scott Ritter's very interesting. What he's saying is that Russia pretty much has already won, that there's only the screaming that's left, that what their military objectives are two. One is denazification, and the other is the demilitarization. So they came in, he says, soft-handed, that they did not bomb barracks, that they were willing to have soldiers stay in their barracks and leave them alone while they took away the weapons and while they took the Nazis so that they could stand trial in Russia and through an international court. Now, I'm also going to include the text of the letter that I talk about, that the speech that Putin gives, because I think we need to know these things. So I'll put that on my Substack also. So that was what Putin said he was going to do. He said, I'll let you walk through the lines and go back home. All we're after are the people who have caused this conflict. So that isn't what happened, because Ukraine has been armed and trained by NATO, and so they've been fighting back. What Scott says is that there are 260,000 troops that are NATO trained in Ukraine, and that there are 130,000 who are militia, who are on reserves. That Russia has only come in with 200,000 troops. And so they have been outnumbered, but they've also been able to strategically herd the Nazi battalion, the Azov battalion, into one remaining stronghold. and that they are about to close in at that point. So his analysis is that this will be over soon, maybe within weeks. And Scott says that Zelensky himself is admitting that Russia is winning every time he says, "You must close the skies. If you don't close the skies, we will lose." So that is already an admission that that's what's happening now. Then Scott talks about the sanctions and says how Biden last June looked Putin in the eye and said, "If you do anything with Ukraine, you will see sanctions like you have never seen before." And so nothing that we've done is surprising Putin. He's been planning for this all along. So Scott answers the question that Michael Hudson had asked in the last article, which was, why did Russia move half of its gold into foreign banks, 650 billion of it? What Scott says is Putin was laying a trap, which he has just sprung. What he has said is that by freezing our assets, you have violated the agreements, and we now cannot participate in that. We cannot accept dollars. And so they now, from any of the countries that were agreeing with the sanctions, now have to pay in rubles. And they will no longer accept the petrodollar for Russian oil and gas. This is critical because Germany can't get through another winter without it. France is in serious trouble. And so now they all have to disengage from the dollar if they're going to be able to survive. He also talks about how the U.S. did him a favor because there were all these Russian oligarchs that he'd had problems with, and they had hidden their money. They had stolen Russian wealth, and they had hidden it all around the world. Now the U.S. just got him rid of that problem because we seized their yachts, their castles, we seized all of their accounts. They're now bankrupt and broke. And what Putin is saying, we don't want you. Go back to those countries that you thought you wanted to be a part of. And the last strategic part, he says, is that there were 20% of the voting public in Russia who were very pro-Western, who would have absolutely thrown Putin out if he had tried to break away from the dollar regime and from the European market. But because he didn't break with them, but instead it was they who broke with him, there's nothing they can complain about. So what he wanted has happened, but it's happened because we made it happen, not because he did it. And then I'll end with Michael Hudson. He reiterates a lot of the points that Scott Ritter makes, but he sees this as having targeted Germany and Europe rather than Russia. He sees it as something that's making sure that Germany and Europe didn't get too cozy with Russia and China and interdependent with them on trade. He also sees this as racist against Russian and German and Chinese, and looking at more of a neoliberal act rather than really examining the economics, where, of course, this has been good for oil and gas. It is going to hit hard with food and fertilizers, which are made from petroleum. So German petroleum fertilizer is going to go out of business. That's going to impact a lot of things that keep cascading down. His prediction is that we're going to need to get a lot more self-sufficient with those pressure points. And that is actually hopeful for me because my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, is all about how we take back our economies, and particularly how we get back into food production and energy production and services that we're supplying to each other. And Michael Hudson sees this as not being very well planned for the banks. He sees the banks as lagging behind. So this seems like a very good time for us to take them back and use them to recreate and regenerate our own community economies. If you would like to join me in that, here's a playlist that is on the Taking Back Local Sovereignty, and here's another episode on Ukraine in case you need to catch up. Thank you, and I hope you subscribe.